Hi everyone, welcome to this week's video lecture. Last week we talked about, in both video lecture and in the classroom, a little bit about how kind of the global economic system works. And today we're going to talk specifically about then what happens when you have a major kind of shock to the global economic system, such as been caused by the current coronavirus pandemic. And so we'll talk a little bit about the future of globalization and what's been going on since the pandemic started. And also the implications for the stuff we were talking about last week when we mentioned things about things like the spatial fix and the fact that the global economy sort of needs to always increase effective demand so that products can be sold, so that people can make them and make money off of making them, and kind of what happens when a lot of world trade essentially comes to a halt or is severely limited. So first of all, just to mention kind of where we are at, one of the questions that we sort of have to ask ourselves is, after the pandemic is over with, are we going to go back to the same level of global integration and globalization and movement of people and goods and all of that as we had before the pandemic, or is it going to kind of really change? And so, of course, some of the questions that you're going to be looking at today in the discussion section for this video has to do with sort of your opinions on what you think may or may not happen there and what industries may be affected more than others, etc. But one of the things that's going to be interesting to see as when this pandemic sort of subsides is the world kind of stay sort of unlinked from each other and separated, or do people see things like something like the pandemic as a reason for the world to, in a sense, become more integrated, rather than being more skeptical or standoffish of what's going on in other countries? Is there going to be more of a recognition that, well, we all sort of are inhabiting the same planet and things like viruses and other kinds of threats threaten everybody, and maybe there needs to be a system of sort of surveillance and management, particularly in terms of health and disease, but other things as well, to sort of think about governing things in a more holistic way. So that's a big question, whether that's going to happen. Are people going to kind of go off into their individual countries a little more, or kind of come together to see these as sort of common problems? And that's a big question as to what we're going to see here in the next coming years and decades. But first, just to talk a little bit about how bad the global economy was hit by the pandemic. So this is a graph looking at the world trade volume. Like, in other words, how much trade is going on around the world. And you can see, these different years, right, from 1990 to 2020. And a few things that you'll notice here. One of these, the blue line is the world trade volume. The world trade volume, the growth in trade volume. And whereas most years, the growth of trade went up by about, between 5 and 10%. You see some economic downturns. Like, so for instance, here in like 2000, 2001, there was an economic downturn and you didn't get much growth in world trade. Then it kind of went up again, almost to 10%. In 2008, 2009, we had a recession, and you can see that global trade volume dropped by about 10%. Then it rebounded, and then it was going along, and then coronavirus hits. And one of the reasons these are all dashed lines is that we're making some guesses, because not all the data is in about exactly how much did world trade contract in, particularly between like March and June of 2020. Some of that data is not all figured out, but we know that it definitely went down pretty severely, and they're estimating that it may have dropped by 30 to 40%. And so that's one measure of kind of how much kind of world trade sort of came to a stop in the last 6 months. Another example is this one, which is this is new export orders. So in other words, when people are ordering things that are going to be made in some other country and then exported, because this gives you an indicator of what's going to be made and then shipped later. And one of the things you see here is that you can see this is 2008, 2009, when there was the last kind of major recession, that this really kind of went down and then went things back up. And these two different lines, one of them is like manufactured good and the other is services, like if you're ordering services from other areas. And the thing that you see here, obviously, is it's covered by my picture here, but this is 2020, and you can see it just sort of falls off a cliff in terms of people ordering things that are going to be produced and made in other countries. Another measure would be how many airplane flights are there on any given day. And the orange line is the exact number, but you can see it kind of goes up and down based on, like, there's more flights, certain times of the week, all that. And the blue line kind of smooths that out in an average. But this starts in January of 2020, and you can see that there was a little over 100,000 flights each day. And then it really crashes down here to April, where you have about 25,000, 30,000 flights every day. And so it really went down pretty dramatically by way more than half, and it's sort of stayed low ever since. It's got rebounded a little bit, but still much, much below the amount of airline flights and movement around the world that was going on prior to the pandemic hitting. So one of the questions that I want you to ask or to answer during this discussion is what industries are going to win and what industries are going to lose from this particular pandemic, right? There's a couple obvious examples that I'll bring up here, but I'm interested in what folks have to say in the discussions. Tourism is a very obvious industry that is going to get hit and hit hard through the pandemic in terms of already lost a lot of income because people didn't travel. People may also be more reluctant to travel later. Of course, some of the money that people might have spent on vacations, they may spend in other things or in more local vacations, driving to the mountains and going camping as opposed to flying to Puerto Rico to go to the beach. But for the most part, travel and tourism is obviously going to be really hit hard. The airlines have been hit hard, other kind of transportation companies, rental car companies, all that kind of thing, hotels, right? The whole travel industry obviously is hammered. Companies that obviously are making a ton of money is whoever owns Zoom is probably rich as anything at this point. And of course, companies like Amazon that sell things and ship them have seen profits absolutely explode during the pandemic. Whereas another industry that really took a hit, of course, is like the entertainment industry because people can't go out to theaters and for concerts and that sort of thing. Restaurant industry as well. So there's definitely been a change of where people spend money. But also because a lot of people lost their jobs, there's just less money and less effective demand, if you remember that term from last week, out there to buy products. And so there's also just an overall sort of suppression of being able to sell things. Okay. One of the other things that people expect to see as the coronavirus pandemic starts going away is what they sometimes refer to as reshoring. And I apologize, this is a little bit blurry. But this is obviously this graphic is from before the pandemic, but there are reasons why, there was a term called offshoring with globalization, which is when factories that used to be in the United States that sold to U.S. consumers moved overseas. And they call that offshoring, like moved to China, moved to Mexico, moved to Vietnam, wherever. And then they would send the products back and sell them here in the United States. What reshoring is when those factories all start moving back, or that production starts moving back into the United States. And there's some reasons to do that. Sometimes the government gives companies incentives to do that. Sometimes just being able to say made in America makes your product more attractive. It may be that because the costs of labor are actually going up in places like China and other areas, that you aren't saving all that much on labor, and so it's worth paying back here. Also, if transportation costs are high, being close to your customers is another reason to move things here. There are also environmental reasons, of course, in that it's much less carbon intensive if you have your manufacturing going on close to where your customers are. You're not moving things all around the world. And in terms of logistics, just being able to move things from raw material to being produced to getting it to your customers, if you don't have to rely on global supply chains and it's all more local, it's a little easier to do the logistics. And of course, the big one here is that if you have your manufacturing going on close to your customers, you don't have to worry about, wars around like tariff wars where people are trying to restrict trade from each other, and also things like the pandemic, which has closed borders and made it difficult to move goods and people around the world. But here's one of the interesting things about reshoring that seems to be going on now, is that yes, it's true that you're starting to see companies and industries think about moving their production facilities back to the United States or back to Europe or back to Japan, closer to where the consumer markets are, where there's wealthier people to buy things. But when people are moving them back, they tend to be automating these operations. In other words, you're seeing an increase in the number of robots and other kind of automated production procedures. So the new factory may be put back in the United States, but it may not necessarily be hiring a lot of people to do the manufacturing, because if you're going to make that big investment and move your factory back from overseas and you're doing it from scratch, there's a lot of money that can be saved by automating a lot of those processes. And so one of the things that we've been seeing economically is as industries move back to the United States, they're more and more automated, which does not mean that, so what it means is we're not really getting a lot more employment out of the factories moving back to the United States because of the automation. Okay. So one of the things you have to remember from last week, right, is we talked a little bit about how kind of the global economy and capitalist economy sort of functions. And we went through all these different, ideas of MCM prime and all that kind of stuff. But one of the things that we talked about here, let's see, is the idea of effective demand, right? That if you only can really make money in this system and things can really operate if you have people that have the desire to buy things and the means to buy things. And one of the things that the pandemic has done is, first of all, created a lot of unemployment, which means there's less people with money and less money around to buy things. So that makes businesses sort of contract because they can't sell as much. Because of all the disruption to global movements and trade, you can't sell to markets as easily that are far away, or take advantage of cheaper labor in other countries and then move it back here so in other words, that spatial fix doesn't work quite as well. But one thing that the government has done in the coronavirus pandemic is public spending, right? These are sometimes referred to as stimulus packages. And basically it's taking government money and pouring it into the economy in different ways. Sometimes it's the paycheck protection programs where businesses are getting money. Also, the direct payments that people have gotten from the federal government. At the time that I'm doing this video, one of those payments happened. I believe it was back in like April or May, and there's talk about doing another one this fall, but that has not yet been decided by Congress. But earlier in the spring, the U.S. government spent almost $2 trillion that they pumped into the global economy, and the idea was, increased unemployment benefits, all this sort of thing, was just put money in people's pockets, then they'll buy stuff, and then companies can keep selling things and making things and keep people employed. And also people can keep paying rent, landlords can keep collecting rent. There's a way of handling the fact that so much income was being lost. There's a way of kind of priming the system. Now, as we talked last week, there's only so far debt can get you, because you've got to imagine you can't just keep making up money and keep dumping into the system forever. And so one of the things that, this idea of increasing effective demand through public spending. And so then we got these 5 fixes, but here's the key. You need more effective demand to do it. And you can keep putting out debt, but if ever there comes a time when the credit markets start getting a little skittish, that the money that they're lending out to people, or if the government starts getting skittish about not being able to put out more money, then we can see a real sort of crisis occur. And if you look back in history, oftentimes a credit crisis is the spark that can really create a really bad economic downturn. And one of the reasons for this is that, as we've talked about last week, the system itself has some contradictions in it, right? You can't just keep growing and growing and growing and growing your economy because, the value's got to come from elsewhere. We also talked about slashing services like social services. You can only do that so far before it starts impacting your workforce. But you can keep pumping out credit to people to kind of prop up demand artificially. But at some point, that can stop working. And when it does, nobody wants to be left holding essentially those debts. Nobody can trust that the money they've lent out is money that they're going to recover. And then the credit markets will sometimes start to freeze up. This happened in 2008 with the housing bubble burst in the United States, and it led to a recession. One of the only things that stopped it was, or you kept it from getting much worse, is the U.S. government pumping in tons of money to the banks and the private sector. That is one of the things to kind of be aware of as we get out of this pandemic and the economic downturn it's causing, keep an eye out for a credit crisis, essentially, because what it means is that people are no longer, it's not working anymore, just putting out more and more credit to prop up demand. And that's usually when things can really freeze up and quite quickly get into really bad economic downturns. Okay. So, in the face of what's been going on in terms of the pandemic and the impacts it might have on the economy, again, going back to these original questions, there's going to be some pain from this because all of the productivity and income and everything else that's been lost this year. And, the way in which the world then bounces back from that is, there's going to be a lot of political decisions that go on. And the big question is, are countries going to feel safer by just having their own national economies be much less a part of the global economy? Of course, then you run up against issues like you're not taking advantage of comparative advantage or some of the things that are efficiencies that are created by trade. But perhaps there's more security. Or, as I mentioned, will people see this as, well, maybe we can go back to a global economy, but we have to have some more safeguards in it and a little more collaboration on health threats, as well as sort of, economic trade. And really one of the things that's going to dictate which path sort of the world goes on this is how people in different countries sort of perceive problems in other places. When we see something like disease or poverty or environmental hazards or even like discrimination and human rights abuses, are people going to generally see that in another country and think, well, that's their problem? Or are we going to kind of look at it in a more global view and think of it as our problem, and one in which that everybody has to kind of get together and help solve? And this is a big, big question about which way the world's going to turn, because both of these tendencies to kind of think in a more global sense and to try and solve problems at sort of a global level for the benefit of everybody is something that's been around as an ethic and a value for a long time, particularly since like World War II. The idea of like universal human rights and all that. But on the other side, there's also always been a really strong ethic of nationalism and people trying to sort of just solve their own problems in their own country and let other countries kind of do their own thing. And so it'll be interesting to see kind of which one of these kind of wins out here in the coming months and years. So that's it for this video lecture. Go ahead and make sure to do those discussion questions, and we'll also have a little bit of discussion about this in class.